long time since Discovery's The Last Alaskans premiered new episodes, but fans still warmly remember the show's cast. One of them is Heimo Korth, an outdoorsman from Wisconsin who's been living alongside his family.
Most people spend their lives trying to get out of hardship. Heimo and Edna Korth spent theirs walking deeper into it, voluntarily. They live hundreds of miles from the nearest road, in a place where temperatures drop to 60 below, where a broken leg or a bad fall isn't an inconvenience, it's a death sentence. They raised a family out there. They buried grief out there. And they kept going. But what the show never fully told you is just how much they actually lost, and how close they came, more than once, to not making it at all. This is the real story of Heimo and Edna Korth, the river that took everything. Before they were famous, before the cameras, before any of it, this couple had already survived something most people couldn't even imagine. In 1982, Heimo and Edna welcomed their first daughter into the world. They named her Colleen. She was born in one of the most remote corners of Alaska. No hospital nearby, no safety net, just the two of them and the wilderness they had chosen. For 2 years, she was the heart of their little world out there on the North Slope. Then, in mid-1984, during what should have been a routine trip on the river, the canoe capsized. Colleen was swept away by the current. She was 2 years old. They searched. They kept searching. Her body was never recovered. If you've watched The Last Alaskans, you've seen Heimo tear up mid-sentence more than once. You've probably wondered what was underneath that. This is it. Even after 4 decades, neither of them can talk about Colleen without their voices breaking. Edna has said it's a wound that never closes. Heimo named the river after her, the Colleen River, and a memorial still stands near its banks today. Every single day they live out there. They live alongside that memory. But here's the thing that doesn't get said enough. They didn't leave. After losing a child in that wilderness, most people would never go back. Heimo and Edna stayed. They rebuilt. And a few years later, they had 2 more daughters, Rhonda and Kryn. That choice, to stay, tells you more about who these 2 people are than anything else in their story. What it doesn't tell you is everything else that was still coming for them. 2 people who were never supposed to meet. The fact that Heimo and Edna even ended up together is almost as unlikely as the life they built. Heimo was born in Germany in 1955 to Irene and Eric Korth. His family immigrated to the United States when he was still a child, and he grew up in Wisconsin and Minnesota, flat, landlocked, far from anything resembling the Arctic. But from early on, he was restless. He hunted with his father and grandfather, spent hours alone in the woods, and felt a pull towards something wilder than suburban America could offer. By the time he was 18, he was done waiting. He left his hometown of Appleton and headed first to the Northwest Territories of Canada, where he picked up work as an assistant to a hunting guide. It was rough, underpaid work, but it taught him things. Then he pushed further, into Alaska. His first Alaskan winter nearly killed him. He was staying in a remote mountain cabin provided by his former boss, and he ran out of food. He fell through the ice. He was alone, completely unprepared for what that environment actually demanded of a person. He reached out to his former boss, who sent him a $500 check and gave him a choice: resupply or come work on St. Lawrence Island in the Bering Sea. Given how that winter was going, he took the island. And that's where he met Edna. Edna was born in Alaska in 1958 and grew up in a small bush village. Her family came from the Yupik people. Her parents and grandparents were subsistence hunters and trappers. She learned to track animals, set traps, skin and butcher game, and gather wild plants for food and medicine before most kids her age were learning to ride a bike. Her uncle Jackson Moyak was one of the most skilled fox trappers in the region, and he taught her how to prep furs, make precise cuts, and preserve the quality of the hair after skinning. This wasn't a hobby or a lifestyle choice for Edna. It was simply how her family had always lived. But Edna's path to Heimo wasn't straightforward either. Before him, she had been engaged to a Swedish biologist. They had 2 children together, Melinda, born in December 1977, and Merlin. Then he died in a plane crash. Edna was devastated. The next man she got involved with was unfaithful and, by her family's account, treated her poorly. Her uncle was protective of her, understandably so, and was slow to warm up to Heimo when the 2 of them started spending time together on St. Lawrence Island. But Heimo was different. He was patient, he worked hard, and he was genuinely drawn to the kind of life Edna already knew how to live. Her uncle eventually gave his blessing. The 2 married and made a decision that would define everything that followed. They would move to Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and build a life there, almost entirely off the grid. At the time, Heimo's cabin on the North Slope was, by his own admission, not exactly welcoming. He was a young man who hadn't thought much about comfort, and Edna made her feelings about the state of that cabin very clear. They fixed it up together. That, in a way, set the tone for everything. 2 people with completely different backgrounds, building something from scratch, 1 repair at a time. What living there actually looks like. People hear off the grid in Alaska and picture something rustic and charming. The reality is something else entirely. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge sits in the northeastern corner of Alaska. In winter, temperatures regularly fall to -40, -50, sometimes colder. The sun disappears for weeks. Supply runs aren't a matter of driving to the store. They require planning months in advance, coordinating with bush pilots, and hoping the weather cooperates. If something breaks, you fix it yourself, or you go without. If you get hurt, help is hours away at minimum. Heimo and Edna built their cabins from local materials, logs and spruce boughs fitted together by hand. They heat with wood. They hunt caribou, moose, and smaller game. They fish. They trap. Heimo traps fur-bearing animals, foxes and marten, as part of how they make a living, continuing a tradition that's been part of Alaskan bush life for generations. Edna processes and preserves the meat, gathers wild plants in season, and manages the kind of daily logistics that most people never have to think about because a grocery store handles them. In winter, they use snowmobiles and dog sleds. In summer, boats and ATVs. They have a team of sled dogs. They have a satellite phone for emergencies, though, as you'll see, emergency gets a different definition out there. When Discovery Channel producers came looking for families living off the grid in Alaska in 2014, Heimo and Edna weren't their easiest sell. The couple was skeptical. They worried the show would misrepresent their lifestyle or, worse, turn it into entertainment at the expense of accuracy. After several conversations, they agreed to participate. The Last Alaskans premiered in 2015, and it drew an average of 1.2 million viewers in its first season. By the 4th season, that number had climbed to 2.1 million. Critics noted the show's authenticity. It wasn't polished or dramatic in the way most reality TV is. It just showed people doing hard things, consistently, with no safety net. That authenticity is what made viewers trust them. And it's what made the difficult moments on the show land so hard. Because those moments were real. When the body starts to fail in the middle of nowhere. Here's what the show captured, and what it couldn't fully capture, about what years in the wilderness do to a human body. In 2016, Heimo was on the roof of his cabin, installing new shingles. He lost his balance. He fell. He landed on his back and broke his pelvis and several ribs. He was alone, in pain, barely able to move. He crawled to his radio and called for help. It took several hours for rescuers to reach him because of where he lives. By the time they arrived, he was hypothermic and in shock. He was airlifted to a hospital in Fairbanks, underwent surgery to repair the broken pelvis, and spent weeks in recovery. Then months of physical therapy. He eventually made it back to the cabin, but that kind of injury, at that age, in that environment, changes things. Then, in 2017, Edna's sister Colleen drowned in the Yukon River. She was experienced outdoors, familiar with the river. But that day, the water was running high and fast. She slipped on the bank and was swept away. Rescuers searched for days. Her body was never found. It was an almost unbearable echo of what had happened to Colleen, their daughter, more than 30 years earlier. A different river, a different person, the same outcome, the same impossible absence. Edna has spoken about her sister in interviews. She was close to her. Colleen visited the cabin often, and she was tight with Rhonda and Kryn. Losing her, the way they lost her, reopened wounds that had never fully closed. And then, in 2019, the cabin burned down. The fire started in the chimney. Heimo was outside chopping wood when he saw the smoke. He ran back, and he and Edna tried to contain it, but the fire moved too fast. It consumed everything: furniture, clothes, tools, hunting and fishing equipment, supplies they had spent years accumulating. They got out with their dogs, and almost nothing else. They had lived in that cabin for over 30 years. It wasn't just a structure, it was the physical record of their life together. The place where their daughters grew up, where they'd grieved, where they'd rebuilt after every previous setback. Gone in a matter of hours. They moved into a tent while they rebuilt. Friends, family, and viewers of the show sent donations. It took months. The new cabin is smaller than the original, but it's theirs again. What doesn't get said often enough is the psychological weight of all of this happening in sequence. The fall, the drowning, the fire, over just 3 years. Most people deal with one of these events in a lifetime. Heimo and Edna dealt with all 3 in a row, with no option to step back, no city to retreat to, no pause button on survival. Bear attacks, broken bones, and getting lost in a blizzard. Even outside of the headline tragedies, life out there had a way of testing them in very specific, very physical ways. In one episode of The Last Alaskans, Heimo was hunting alone when a bear charged him. He tried to scare it off, yelling, waving his arms, and it didn't work. The bear knocked him to the ground and bit him on the arm and leg. It clawed at his face. He was bleeding badly and close to losing consciousness. He reached for his hunting knife and stabbed the bear in the eye. The bear released him. He ran. He made it back to the cabin, where Edna cleaned and bandaged his wounds. He recovered over several weeks. The fact that he survived came down to a single decision made in a fraction of a second, with a bear on top of him. Edna had her own serious injury when she broke her leg in 2 places during a fall while gathering firewood. Heimo built a stretcher from branches and carried her back to the cabin. The next day, he used their boat to get her to the nearest town. She had surgery and spent weeks in the hospital before returning home. Out there, that sequence, fall, makeshift stretcher, boat ride, hospital, is the emergency protocol. There was also a winter day when Edna, while checking trap lines, followed a fox track too far and got completely turned around. She couldn't find Heimo, couldn't see any landmarks she recognized, and knew that if she didn't find shelter before nightfall, she wouldn't survive the night. She found a small cave, crawled inside, and waited out the darkness. The next morning, she climbed out and started walking. Hours later, she found Heimo, exhausted and hypothermic himself, sitting on a rock, unable to go further. She helped him back to the cabin. Two people, lost, finding each other. It sounds like a metaphor. Out there, it was just Tuesday. And then there was the pneumonia. Heimo was out hunting when he started experiencing chest pain and couldn't breathe. He made it back to the cabin. Edna called for a medevac on the satellite phone. He was airlifted to a hospital and treated with antibiotics for several days before being cleared to return. What makes all of this even harder to process is the isolation factor. When something goes wrong for most people, help is close. A phone call gets an ambulance there in minutes. Out in the Arctic refuge, a satellite phone call gets you a bush pilot. If the weather allows flying, if one is available, if visibility is good enough to land. There have been instances where Heimo or Edna had to manage injuries for hours, sometimes overnight, before any outside help could physically reach them. That's not a dramatic detail. It's a practical reality of the choice they made. Every injury carries a second layer of risk that has nothing to do with the injury itself. It has to do with where they are. The remoteness that gives their life its meaning is the same thing that makes every accident a potential catastrophe. They've known that since the beginning. They've never pretended otherwise. Every one of these incidents would be a major event in an ordinary person's life, something you'd talk about for years. For Heimo and Edna, they're chapters in a much longer story that just kept adding pages. What they've built and what they carry. After everything, and there has been a lot of everything, here's where Heimo and Edna Korth actually stand. Their daughters, Rhonda and Kryn, both left the wilderness. Rhonda married, had 2 children, and works as a nurse in Fairbanks. Kryn is also married with children and works as a teacher in Wasilla. Both of them grew up in one of the harshest environments in North America, and they chose, deliberately, to build lives inside the modern world their parents stepped away from. Heimo and Edna visit them. They all spend time together in the wilderness when they can. The grandkids have learned to fish and hunt from Heimo, the way Heimo once learned from his father and grandfather. Heimo has written 2 books, The Final Frontiersman and Surviving the Island of Grace, about his experiences in the Arctic. Edna wrote The Last Alaskan's Cookbook, featuring recipes built around ingredients you can actually find and prepare in the wilderness. They do public speaking. They offer guided tours of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. They sell merchandise and maintain a presence online. Their combined net worth is estimated at around $180,000. Not wealthy by most standards, but they've never been chasing wealth. They've been chasing something harder to name. What's worth sitting with at the end of all this is the full weight of what they've carried. A daughter lost to a river at 2 years old, her body never found. A sister lost to a river decades later, same outcome. A near-fatal fall, a bear attack, a cabin fire that erased 30 years of accumulated life, broken bones, pneumonia, hypothermia, getting lost. All of it in one of the most remote and unforgiving places on Earth. And they're still there. Not because they have no choice. They have always had a choice. Their daughters proved that. They stay because something about that place, and about each other, makes it worth staying for. Heimo once said that he didn't feel at home anywhere until he got to Alaska. Edna grew up knowing no other way to live. Somewhere between his restlessness and her roots, they found the same answer. There's also something worth noting about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge itself. For years, it has been at the center of political debates about oil drilling and land use. Heimo and Edna are among the last people with a grandfathered right to live inside its boundaries, a right that doesn't transfer and won't be granted again. When they're gone, that chapter of human life in that specific stretch of wilderness closes permanently. They're not just living out there. They're the last record of what it looked like when people actually inhabited that land on its own terms without extracting it for profit. That context doesn't make their story bigger than it already is, but it does make it more specific and more irreplaceable. The memorial for their daughter Colleen still stands near the river that carries her name. 40 years later, Heimo and Edna still live within reach of it. That's not a television narrative. That's just what a life actually looks like when you refuse to leave. What are your thoughts about the life of Heimo and Edna Korth? Share with us in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.